you guys. Today we're going to spend a little time talking about what a blood glucose spike means to the average healthy adult. So for anyone not struggling with diabetes or prediabetes, what does this topic mean to you? Throughout the day, our body will inevitably see rises or spikes in our blood sugar level. In this example, depending on when you eat, your blood sugar will rise and our body's normal response will be to bring it back down. We'll get into those details later. What's important to understand is that there's a normal range that we want our blood sugar to typically fall between. We're kind of representing it here by in between those dashed green lines, and it's important for our blood to generally stay in that range even when it's peaking or spiking. It's also important to recognize that when our blood sugar comes back down, we want it to stay in that normal range as well. There is such thing as hypoglycemia, meaning low blood sugar, and we don't want that for our bodies either. So we want that sweet spot, not too high, not too low. This is a good place to stop and consider a few different topics. Let's take some time to talk about what we mean by a spike. How do we define that? Let's talk a little bit about the fact that everyone experiences these rises in blood sugar throughout the day. And let's talk about how the body uses insulin in response to a rise in blood sugar. There's not a general consensus for what a blood glucose spike entails. Some believe it is when you have a blood glucose peak that is outside the normal range that stays there for several hours, while some believe it is simply the sharp rise that the blood glucose experiences, which typically we see after consuming a meal that has carbohydrates in it. Those carbohydrates are broken down in our body, and glucose is then released into our blood system so our body can utilize it for energy. A rise in blood glucose or experiencing a glucose spike is a natural process within our body. While we might be focusing on a rise relative to what we consume and eat, there are other factors that can also affect why your blood sugar levels go up. That can include quality of sleep. That can include activity levels. If you find you're working out at higher intensities, that can raise your blood glucose levels. Also, stress can affect your blood glucose levels as well. So it's important to keep these things in mind, that it's not simply what we eat. Perhaps our diets have more of an impact, but there are other factors at play in our body. So now we're going to take a look at what a glucose spike looks like in a healthy adult versus an adult who is pre-diabetic or diabetic. According to the graph, we see that there is indeed a spike or a rise for the normal or healthy adult, indicated by that gray line. It peaks, it comes back down and stabilizes, whereas for a pre-diabetic or diabetic adult, the rise in glucose level is significantly higher, and it also takes longer to come back down. The body's natural response to a blood glucose spike or rise is going to be the release of insulin from the pancreas, or more specifically, the beta cells on the pancreas. As we can see in this graph, over time, the body will experience a blood glucose rise, and at a similar time, it will start producing insulin. As the insulin is peaking, we see that the blood glucose concentration comes down, and that is the body's normal response to when blood glucose rises. It's going to release insulin, which helps to control a blood sugar response and to typically keep it within a normal range. There are other hormones that are involved and other processes in the body to deal with the valleys or when the blood sugar drops. But in general, the body has a response and it keeps a tight range on where our blood glucose levels should be in response to a rise or a fall. There are different ways to measure and assess blood sugar levels or blood glucose spikes, but what we're going to be focusing on is the postprandial or post-meal level of blood sugar levels. So for the typical adult, we're looking to have a value in milligrams per deciliter of less than 140, and you can see what that looks like relative to the pre-diabetic and diabetic states. The health risks associated with chronic and excessive blood glucose spikes include higher risk of type 2 diabetes, also called T2DM, increased risk for insulin resistance, and risk for heart disease. So according to the International Diabetes Foundation, they have a few guidelines for healthy adults, again, anyone not dealing with diabetes or pre-diabetes who has a standard glucose response in their body. So typically, your blood glucose levels will stay below 140 milligrams per deciliter postprandial or after eating. And this is typically true most of the time. Between 95 to 99% of the time, your blood glucose levels should stay below that value. Something to understand too, based off these numbers, is that there may be times where your blood sugar level goes beyond 140. And this is something you may want to consider talking to a medical professional or your primary care physician about. If this is something you've experienced not very often, it may not be any cause for concern, but there are certain levels in which it is good to consider doing further blood sugar testing. But in general, a healthy adult will typically have a body that keeps their blood glucose below a certain level, and typically that peak glucose spike we see will be within 30 minutes of eating. Next, we're going to talk about high glycemic index foods versus low glycemic index foods and how these can contribute more quickly or not to blood glucose spiking more quickly. Low glycemic index foods tend to be a lot of different vegetables and a lot of different fruits, though there are different vegetables and fruits that can have a high glycemic index. This also includes beans and legumes, certain kinds of nuts, and certain dairy products that help to raise blood glucose levels less quickly. Foods that tend to raise blood sugar more quickly or high glycemic index foods tend to include a lot of processed foods, fast foods, overly sweetened beverages, and items that are very, very carb heavy like white breads and cereals. And potatoes is on the list, but in the right context, potatoes can be a very satisfying food, but depending on the overall meal, they may or may not contribute more to a blood sugar rise. So even though our body is built in general to keep our blood sugar levels within a normal range most of the time, we still have a part to play in how we structure our meals and our snacks to promote healthy blood sugar levels. And we do this through a balanced diet. So consider, where can we add fiber into our meals and snacks, meaning fruits and vegetables. Thinking about complex carbohydrate sources and utilizing those as they help to release our blood sugar more slowly. Considering meal sizes and maybe breaking down some of our larger meals and combining them into a smaller other meal throughout the day, and just considering that a large meal is more likely to bring our blood sugar levels up. And last, looking at any refined carbohydrate sources that we enjoy as more of a treat throughout the week instead of something we typically eat regularly. It's really not anything new in terms of eating healthy, but it just comes down to balancing and finding out what works for you and your specific preferences. In conclusion, it's normal for our body to experience rises and falls in blood sugar levels or blood glucose spikes. Blood glucose levels are also related to factors outside of our eating and carb patterns, related to things like sleep, stress levels, and activity levels. What we need to keep in mind is that if we're tested and we see that we have prolonged periods of blood glucose spikes that are also outside of the normal range, that might be something to check on with a medical professional. And lastly, it's important to get regular checkups with our healthcare professionals. That way, if anything pops up that looks abnormal around a blood glucose spike or blood glucose levels, they can direct us accordingly to see if there's any risk for prediabetes or diabetes. It's also important to recognize that we do have a say through our diet in supporting healthy blood glucose levels. So one final thought on a device called a continuous glucose monitor. This is a device typically used by someone who is pre-diabetic or diabetic to monitor their blood sugar levels throughout the day. This is not something that the average healthy adult needs to consider as a device. Our body is built with mechanisms to help keep a tight rein on our blood sugar levels and the spikes and drops. Unless you're working with a medical professional who is doing regular blood work with you, if they don't suggest the need for this device, this is not something the average person needs to go out and buy.